A reduction in oil and gas industry emissions is good news for a heating planet. And today we'll talk about the role of the oil and gas industry in our overall emissions and what role and responsibility Saskatchewan plays in helping meet Canada's emission targets. We have a couple of guests who are joining us for the show. And this all comes as Premier Scott Moe boasted on Facebook about the progress this province is making in lowering greenhouse gas emissions. He writes, Saskatchewan is leading the way in lowering greenhouse gas emissions from the oil and gas sector. According to the 2024 Oil and Gas Emissions Management Regulations Annual Report, emissions from venting and flaring are down 71% since 2015. That's like taking 1.7 million cars off the road for a year. So today on Blue Sky, we want to hear from you. What are your questions for our experts? Call 1-800-716-2221 or email bluesky@cbc.ca. And we have a couple of guests that are with us throughout the show as we're talking about oil and gas, the biggest emitter here in Saskatchewan, and talk about some of the technology being used to reduce emissions and what this progress means in the grand scheme of things. Eric Nickel is Chief Operating Officer with the Petroleum Technology Research Centre in Regina. It does research and development into projects to reduce the carbon footprint and increase production of subsurface energy. Welcome to Blue Sky, Eric.
Thank you very much.
And Margot Hurlbert is a professor in the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Regina. She is the Canada Research Chair for Climate Change, Energy and Sustainability, and she's also in our Regina studio. Thanks for joining us, Margot.
Pleasure to be here.
Okay, so I mentioned there in the introduction the Oil and Gas Emissions Management Regulations Annual Report came out recently. That's the responsibility of Saskatchewan's Ministry of Energy and Resources. And this document, this annual report, says that provincial emissions from venting and flaring at upstream oil facilities fell by 71% compared to 2015 levels and by 13% compared to 2023 levels. Margot, I would like to start with you. How big of a deal are these numbers?
Yeah, no, these are great numbers. They're significant when you look at the overall reductions for Saskatchewan in this sector. 79% is a real significant reduction, almost half of all of the reductions in Saskatchewan. So these are worthy of some attention.
I just want to make sure we all understand kind of what exactly we're talking about. There is mentioning of flaring and venting. For people who don't know, what exactly is the difference between those two when it comes to oil and gas?
Sure. Thank you, Teresa. When oil is produced, there is what we call associated gas with it. And this may be methane, a combination of methane and hydrogen sulfide. Other gases, mostly it's usually methane. And traditionally, because it's not real reliable, it kind of comes in spurts and fits, and it just gets flared at the well site. What's been going on more recently is that this gas is gathered and collected and either sold to the market or utilized in the oil field itself, either to run the oil field operations there, which is mainly how that works. Okay, so now that we have a bit of an understanding, I want to stay with you, Eric. We just heard from Margot. She sounded fairly positive, I want to say, about the numbers. What's your take on this? Oh, I think it's great news, and it just speaks to the fact that the oil industry in Saskatchewan and throughout Canada, for that matter, is interested in reducing emissions. I'm not with an oil company directly, but anytime I've met anyone with an oil company, especially in the executive, they have no interest in increasing emissions or doing damage to the environment. And it's organizations like ours that help find solutions, technical solutions usually for problems like flaring and venting, and there are sort of interesting ways of better capturing that gas and making it available for sale or for use on the market.
And I definitely want to talk a little bit more about the capturing and those technologies. But Margot, I just want to break these numbers down a little more and understand this annual report from the province. What are the challenges in trying to actually get accurate information from emissions target, Margot?
Great question. And these are, and maybe I'll go first and Eric can help me out. These are actually really challenging emissions because there's leakage within our systems. So the way they're calculated is a bit complex, and Eric can speak to that. But what I will note is that there are ways to confirm the amounts, and I'm interested in this area because it is so technical and it is so problematic. So there are studies that have been done with satellite or with aerial data through airplanes actually testing the methane in the air, and they come back and they're a bit lower, but not hugely. I'll let you judge what huge is. So anywhere from 1.2 overinflation by some of these to 1.7 in one study. And these studies, one of them was done by Environment Climate Change Canada scientists. So these, the data we're looking at is bottom-up data, so data that came from the field. So the aerial data is something that can confirm that bottom-up data, and we're not actually looking at it.
What are your thoughts on this, Eric?
Yes, Margot's correct. The way it's measured is kind of interesting. We have it either right at the wellhead, and that would be the emissions that you know is within the oil. But then there's what's called fugitive emissions, which means they're sort of escaping through valves and through other surface casing at the wellhead. And measuring those is a little more difficult, and that's where the satellite and drone data comes in to sort of confirm what we know. The challenge, as always, is to reduce those fugitive emissions and make them part of the capturing process.
So just make sure I summarize this properly. Despite the challenges, you would say those numbers would be fairly reliable? Margot and Eric, who wants to?
I would say they would be fairly as reliable as we can get them, and going on the principle that which gets measured gets managed. I think we're using those numbers to manage those emissions as well as we can.
Perfect. I'm just going to remind our listeners, we are talking about oil and gas sector in Saskatchewan, what technology is being used to reduce emissions in that sector, and what this progress actually means in the grand scheme of things. If you have any questions for our guests or any comments, you can call us at 1-800-716-2221 or email bluesky@cbc.ca. I want to talk a little bit more about this reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And Eric, I want to go to you because you already talked about carbon capture a little bit, but we look at this number, the 71%. What is exactly behind this number, this reduction that we're talking about here?
Well, I think it comes from, we're trying to reduce all forms of impacts, not just greenhouse gases, but surface footprint impacts and all of those things. And what we can do, and what we've been studying at the PTRC, is utilizing enhanced oil recovery to get more oil out of individual wells. An oil well typically only gets 5 to 10% of the oil that's it accesses for various reasons, very technical. But if we can increase that to 10 to 20% through the use of things like CO2 enhanced oil recovery, that's a benefit to the province because it reduces the need for more drilling. So it saves the water and the impact on the surface environment there. But also it involves injecting CO2 into a reservoir, which effectively keeps it permanently stored, even though it's also bringing out more oil while we do that. So the emissions intensity of that resulting barrel of oil is approximately 1/3 of what it would be otherwise.
We have a caller on the line here, who I want to go to, Darren in Regina. He has a question about orphan wells. Darren, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi. Yeah, just curious with the monitoring of stray methane or whatever it is, H2S, et cetera. how much of the refund is it broken down to active and orphan wells? And if the orphan wells are deteriorating and leaking, is it the taxpayer that's paying for remediating those, or is it oil companies themselves?
That's a great question, Darren. And I would assume that as this is oil and gas companies reporting, it's active. You can actually see the lists in the announcements if you drill deep into the background documents of the 30, 40 companies that are the oil and gas companies reporting on this. So my concern with orphaned wells is those are probably not associated with the 30 or 40 companies that are in the documentation. So I would make that assumption. Although I did not prepare by looking at the orphaned wells. So that's part of why the satellite data on methane is so important. And some of those studies do capture like oil fields, oil areas, and the actual methane coming out. Now, the sad news, though, is that the methane satellite that was being run by some of the private companies like Google has been lost in the last few months. So they're unsure where that is. But there's still other reporting devices out there for methane. The World Bank tracks some of the flaring of gas that goes on. There's a carbon mapper that the European Union uses. So there's still some data out there that can be accessed.
And if I could jump in here just quickly, for our listeners who might not know what an orphan well is, can you quickly help us out there, Eric?
Sure. An orphaned well is a well that hasn't been abandoned. Often when a company drills a well, they take on responsibility for the environmental safety of that well. They sell it, even if the well is no longer productive, they keep it on their books as something to abandon. That company then gets sold to another company, and that well goes along to the next company, and ultimately gets sold to a company that may go bankrupt or no longer exist. And this well that has been sitting there for many years is now the responsibility of the government, unfortunately. And there's been a program over the last few years to properly remediate these orphaned wells. So I don't have numbers, but my knowledge is that the Saskatchewan Research Council has been working on remediating these wells, and they would do so in a fashion that would mitigate fugitive gas emissions out of them.
Eric and Margot, I want to bring in our next guest, John Jeffrey. He is CEO of Saturn Oil and Gas. He's actually a graduate from the University of Saskatchewan, but now lives in Calgary, and that's where we reach him right now. Good afternoon, John, and welcome to Blue Sky.
Hey, thanks for having me.
First of all, tell us a bit about your company. What projects do you have in Saskatchewan right now?
So we are a light oil producer in Saskatchewan. I think we're the fifth biggest now, primarily focused in southeast Saskatchewan, with some assets around Kindersley and some around southwest Saskatchewan. I just want to comment on that last question as well. The Orphan Well Fund is largely funded through the industry. So all oil companies, they do pay into the Orphan Well Fund. So although the government does manage it, by and large, that is funded through the oil and gas industry in the province.
Thanks for that information. I want to go back to your company, though. You talked about your work in Saskatchewan. I think you said you're the fifth biggest light oil producer. So what is exactly the scale here? Like how much production, how many employees are we talking about?
Yeah, so overall, we're 45,000 barrels a day. Again, primarily light oil, so not a lot of gas production. We're close to 400 employees. Probably 250 of those would be in Saskatchewan. We actually started our company originally out of Saskatoon. Just eventually, we kind of outgrew it, couldn't find the staff, couldn't find the people, so we ended up moving to Calgary, but still maintain a big presence there. We have a number of field offices there, and quite a lot of our technical staff reside in the province as well.
And then where does the oil go?
Yeah, it's a question we get a lot. Actually, it's funny because generally once it hits the mainline pipeline, it's just sold. So people are like, who buys your oil? And it's a tough question because unless you are a shipper on that main line, generally once it gets to that Enbridge main line in Cromer, Manitoba, there it's just sold. So we get the oil to there. From there, it's just world market pricing. And there's a number of shippers that buy and sell oil, but that's the sales point. Right there. Generally, it goes, all the oil in Saskatchewan generally flows into the States through Oklahoma, through Cushing, and then eventually into West Texas or perhaps on the East Coast.
Yeah, I just want to give our listeners a quick reminder. If they have any questions for any of our guests, this is a chance to talk with someone who runs an oil company. This is a chance to talk with some of our experts and ask your questions. You can call 1-800-716-2221 or email bluesky@cbc.ca. John, I'm curious how, especially since we talk about oil and gas, kind of also emissions, how have you seen the sector change over the years, especially in Saskatchewan?
Well, I mean, you guys are right. Like it's fugitive emission. Methane is really the big one that the industry is focusing on. Again, the difference between methane and CO2, although similar, is methane retains more heat when it's released in the atmosphere, so it does a lot more to contribute to global warming. So methane is the one that we really look at. So it used to be that you'd bring a well on, and to their point, if you have associated gases, you just vent those off the top of the tank and you wouldn't try and collect them if you couldn't do so economically. Now there's a big push against that. So now generally what we do is we try and flare that. But even through flaring, you are just wasting energy. You're just wasting something that could be consumed. And that's kind of bothered us for a long time. So where possible, we will tie in that energy. Now, sometimes you get in situations where you're not able to. So a big project that we've worked on for a long time, not a large project, but something we've worked on a long time is what can we do with this energy? And so, this was years ago now, what we started seeing is it's very difficult to create power to sell back to the grid with it. But one of the things that we looked at doing and we'd implemented throughout specifically our Kindersley fields was we would generate power and use that, but without a draw, you need to have some form of draw. And if you can't sell it to the grid, what do you do with it? We did power our facilities with it, still had too much gas. So in those cases, we would actually put out sea cans full of Bitcoin miners. So effectively, we would do sea cans filled with computer processors, and that would mine Bitcoin for us. Again, it's processing power the world would otherwise consume anyways. But if we can do so with stranded energy, it was cash flow positive for us, which is great. It's consuming a natural resource instead of just flaring it. So it's kind of a neat project. We've been at it for a number of years, and I think it's catching on. There's a number of other companies that are getting into it now, but it's kind of a cool project. People have looked at greenhouses, all sorts of things, because it's just free energy that we want to capture and we want to harness.
I'm really curious. You mentioned you've seen some other companies do the same with the Bitcoins. That just seems so random. What other kind of projects, ideas have you seen in the industry?
Well, it's funny because years ago I was looking at this company and they were set up in Vancouver, and they were saying how expensive their property taxes were, and cooling is a big thing there because the processors run very warm. And we thought, well, Saskatchewan, I believe on average is as cold as Siberia, and if you're sitting on an oil lease with no really associated property taxes, it just made a heck of a lot more sense to have them in Saskatchewan than it ever did in downtown Vancouver, in my mind. And we have free energy that we are looking for somewhere to deploy it. A number of companies have now started up where they will just approach an oil company and say, hey, I can see you're flaring. We'll take your gas and we'll do everything, and you'll save the penalty of flaring, and we'll just consume it to mine Bitcoin. So there's a lot of different versions of that. How we got started, we actually went out, outfitted the sea cans, put the generators in, and did it all ourselves. But now there's a number of companies that really just make it a lot easier for companies to get involved, and again, consuming that resource instead of just seeing it flared or worse, vented.
Before we take a short break for headlines, I want to ask John and Margot if they maybe have any questions for John.
That's actually a really exciting, innovative thing. And questions I have, I guess, are how do you, John, respond to the criticism that we're not reducing the amount of energy we're using. Like their enhanced oil recovery and these great innovative usages of energy are great, but we keep increasing our carbon footprint.
You mean specific to our industry?
Yes.
Well, the criticism Canada gets is largely due to its oil sands. Again, oil sands is just a much different product than what we make. So the best way to illustrate this, if you take a container of our oil, it's a lot like motor oil. You can put it in a cup, you can dump it out. That's what you visually see. It goes in a pipeline. That's what you get. Now, if you look at oil sands, it's a lot like molasses. So you couldn't dump it out of a cup. It's very long chains of carbon. It's very thick. So it takes a lot more energy. You can only pull it out of the ground with steam. That's the steam assisted gravity drain. And then once on surface, you need to either upgrade it, which is breaking those chains or dilute it. So the oil sands is very energy intensive, and that's one of the things where Canada does get a bit of a bad rep. Again, they have taken huge steps in making that even cleaner as well. Our light oil production, which is what we focus on, and most people out of the Fort McMurray area, generally it's a lot cleaner barrel. The biggest use or the biggest production of CO2 is, we have trucks on the road, we have oil haulers on the road, things like that. So our actual operations, again, we've reduced methane reduction by 30% from 23 to 24. So very little as it pertains to methane. And even with the CO2, we are finding these different ways. But again, when you look at light oil compared to the oil sands are just a much larger contributor than light oil. Not saying that there's more work that we can do, and we are working towards it.
We are talking today about technology being used to reduce emissions in the oil and gas sector and what progress actually means in the grand scheme of things. If you have any questions for our guests, you can get them in now. Just call 1-800-716-2221 or email bluesky@cbc.ca. And I want to get back to you, John, for people just tuning in. John Jeffrey is CEO of Saturn Oil and Gas. I'm just looking right now, John, at some of the Government of Canada data. It says Saskatchewan's emissions per capita are the highest in Canada, and the largest emitting sector in Saskatchewan are oil and gas production. So I'm just wondering, following maybe a little bit of Margot's question, how can we there are some innovations, some projects we've talked about, but are we really making a big difference to, how optimistic are you that oil and gas can really, really improve those numbers and improve those statistics?
Well, I think you let off the section well about how far the oil industry has already came. I think per capita is a bit misleading, just given the population difference. Per barrel is kind of a more relevant number, in my opinion, just because, you can produce. Production and population don't really go hand in hand in that sense. But I think technology has come a long ways. The PTRC, again, works closely with us. CO2 floods that was talked about earlier, I think those are great projects. One of the problems that Saskatchewan has is you can't even get a reliable source of CO2. We just don't have a concentrated enough manufacturing and industrial base to take that CO2 and apply it. I know that they've done a great job in trying to source more, but again, there's projects like that could happen. But again, it's more pipelines, it's capturing, and trying to put all that together is very difficult. One thing they've done a great job on is that new technology. Those cameras and sensors, they're on drones, they're on planes, they're on satellites, cameras, even in-house. We have our own monitoring equipment that we do internal audits. There's more outside companies that will come and do those audits. And again, it's all of those things just to find the fugitive emissions, find the methane, and then find that CO2 and then just reduce it across the board.
So before I let you go, John, do you think it's doable to meet the emissions targets set out by the federal government?
I mean, it's tough to say. I think if there's a constant improvement, again, there's always the lowest hanging fruit. That's what you target first. And you do exhaust, you will exhaust, what is economic. But again, as long as we're always improving, and again, we have an incentive to do so because flaring, CO2 and methane and natural gas, that's energy. That's energy we'd love to capture. We'd love to sell. I'd love to turn it into Bitcoin and heating fluid and everything else. So we'd love to capture that. We're incentivized to capture it. And I think working even closer with the government and the PTRC, I think that's going to go a long ways in achieving those goals.
John, I really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
John Jeffrey is CEO of Saturn Oil and Gas. He's a graduate from the U of S, and he now lives in Calgary. I want to go back to our two guests on the show. Margot Hurlburt is a professor in the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Regina and the Canada Research Chair for Climate Change, Energy and Sustainability. And Eric Nickel is Chief Operating Officer with the Petroleum Technology Research Center. Before we have an email from a listener with a question, which I would love to get to. But first, Eric, I would like you to respond with some of your thoughts, especially on that optimism that we heard from John when it comes to targets.
Yeah, we're doing a lot of different things to hopefully reduce emissions, and we've been doing it for a long time. When it comes to CO2 emissions, it was way back in the early 2000s or late 1990s that the company that owned Weyburn at that time decided they were going to flood it with CO2 in order to get more oil out. That was not an uncommon practice. It had been done in Texas up to that point. But what was new in the early 2000s, and PTRC was at the forefront of this, was that we were going to look at it from the standpoint of reducing emissions by storing that CO2 underground, not just disposing of it, but storing it. And the difference between storage and disposal is that we put in monitoring systems to ensure that the CO2 is where we know it is. The amount going down is carefully measured and accounted for, and ultimately it's monitored long term to ensure that it's not escaping out of the zone that it's injected into. So with an oil field like Weyburn, over 40 million tons of CO2 has been injected into that field. None has been measured to have leaked. And from that 40 million tons, we've increased oil production in the province with a lower emissions intensity oil, which is the important aspect of that. It's still oil. We still have to refine it, and it still gives off the emissions when we burn it, but it is a lower emissions intensity. And the goal is to have more of that. And John mentioned that it is difficult to find more sources of CO2, but I can say that the industries in Saskatchewan are actively looking for ways to reduce their own emissions, and carbon capture is certainly a part of that.
Here's one thing I've always wondered when we talk about injecting carbon dioxide underground. Like, is there a limit? Are there any, what are the potential risks? Like, it just seems like can we just endlessly do that?
Well, you can't endlessly do that just anywhere. Saskatchewan happens to be a place where we can almost endlessly do that. We have a deep formation called the Deadwood Formation, and it is probably 100 to 150 meters thick by thousands of kilometers wide, stretching from Deadwood in South Dakota to the northernmost part of Saskatchewan below the Shield. And that gives us a lot of space. So it's a sandstone, and the CO2 goes in the spaces between the sand grains like a huge sponge that's 100 meters by thousands of kilometers, and we can inject CO2 into there, track it, and ensure that it doesn't leave. Longer term, the CO2 eventually mixes with salt water that's in that formation, and ultimately it turns itself into new minerals and salts that are in that formation, locking it away permanently.
Got it. I just want to now go to the email we got from one of our listeners. I think maybe Margot, I'll start with you if you can help, but then of course Eric, jump in anytime. It's two questions, so maybe I'll start with the first one, let you answer, and then go to the second one. The email is from Michael. Michael writes, how does the recent announcement of continuing using coal in Saskatchewan as an energy source circumvent the gains made in reducing emissions from flaring and venting?
Great question, Michael. I agree. Like, we really in Saskatchewan have to think of our total emissions. So they are linked. Although power production on coal is with SaskPower, federal regulations and the flaring is by agreement, the federal government has allowed Saskatchewan to regulate that. So they're in different spheres, but I think they both are important in considering how Saskatchewan is going to address its emissions with global warming, because the abandonment of the decommissioning of our coal plants, I think more accurately say, putting off the decommissioning of the coal plants is keeping our emissions high in power production. And this news in the oil wells, the flaring, is good news, but it's not great, fantastic news for a few reasons. Yeah.
Eric, do you want to add
Sure.
to this?
What we have learned from one of the units at the Boundary Dam coal plant, BD3, many years ago, probably in 2008 to 10 or so, they put carbon capture on that. And obviously, it was in the media. It operated in fits and starts when it first came online, but now it's operating very well. It's operating to nameplate capacity, capturing almost 3,000 tons of CO2 a day, effectively reducing the emissions of that coal power by 90+%. What the only emission then becomes is this liquid form CO2 that we can inject into deep water aquifers or deep water formations like the Deadwood, or we can sell it to companies like Whitecap that own the Weyburn field that would use it for producing more oil. Either way, that CO2 is not hitting the atmosphere anymore. So optimistically, I would hope that with the continuation of coal in the province, we have a very strong consideration of putting carbon capture on those coal plants as well.
And here is the second question from Michael that I would like to share with you. Margot, maybe you can help out again as our first line of help. Michael's question is, what type of emission risks exist with transitioning to energy sources such as solar, wind, geothermal, and battery?
Ooh, geez. So I don't think we have time, nor would we want to get into each of those individually. But starting with the emissions and the totality of the emissions, which is kind of the first question of Michael, with carbon capture and sequestration, it's fantastic, but we've still got 10%. Like, they're only taking 90% out. So we're not at zero, right? So we've still got coal plants that are 10% emitting, right? So we've cleaned up 90% of them. And we've also had to increase the amount of power those coal plants are producing to run all of the facilities for the carbon capture, right? So we call that parasitic power. So we've had to increase the amount of energy just to clean the energy. So carbon capture and sequestration is fantastic. We've got all this coal in Saskatchewan, but it's not getting to the end goal of nothing, like zero. And then, great question, Michael, because people are starting to really consider what we call the cradle-to-grave emissions of all sources, including solar, because we have to construct solar panels. We have to mine or buy from China the contents of the solar panels. We have to transport them. We have to construct them. Wind turbines, same thing, require usually concrete or something. So we need to think about, yes, they're clean energy and the prices have gone down, but they cost in the building of them and then in the decommissioning. And people are starting to question, well, what happens to wind turbines at the end of their life? And the answer is they get buried somewhere. And in the United States, I know it's in North Dakota because I've driven by it. But so those questions are becoming really important, and batteries are now becoming important. But good news is with batteries, there's certain recycling programs that are happening. And I think back to the flare gas, thinking about the emissions that we've had from the leakage are being flared, which John talked about and Eric have talked about, but there's still CO2 emissions. So there's a question of economics of why haven't we done this earlier? And the answer is it was about the carbon pricing, and it was about costing those emissions. So it was cheaper for the oil and gas companies to actually flare them or to do something that John has described. But this was really low-hanging fruit. And a question I have is, well, why didn't we think about this, or why didn't it happen 2 decades ago?
Thank you so much, Margot, for this. We have a couple of callers on the line I would like to get to before the end of the show. I'm going to Warren in Gray. Hi, Warren. Thanks for calling Blue Sky.
Thank you. I know there's a price difference between West Texas Intermediate and, I don't know if it's called Western Select. And if we had more value added versus pipelines that ship it all out of, a lot of it goes out of country to Oklahoma, Texas, and would refineries be a better option versus pipelines?
Great question, and one that I'm often asked. Typically for a few reasons. Speaking purely from the technical side, Margot can maybe speak to the financial and policy side of it, but we refine enough oil for our own domestic use, not throughout all of Canada, throughout much of Canada. It is more efficient to ship oil via pipeline as crude rather than as refined products for a few reasons. The refined products actually increase the volume. The process of refining oil increases the volume of that refined product. So 1 barrel of oil produces 1.2, or I think it's 1.3 barrels of refined product. So it's a less efficient way of moving energy around North America. That said, we do have the co-op refinery here, and it has expanded over time, meets the needs of Western Canada. There is, I believe, 5 refineries in Edmonton that meet the needs. But then there are geographical challenges to moving our oil throughout this large country. Obviously, you have Canada's biggest refinery, Irving, in New Brunswick, that has to operate on foreign oil because we just simply don't have the ability to move oil out there in an economic way or in a way that is acceptable to all Canadians. So there are challenges that are primarily geographic. In the financial sense, all of this kind of gets arbitraged in the end of the day, where we are moving oil back and forth between Canada and the United States, refining it near the population centers rather than shipping refined products as much. Margot?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Margaret, do you want to add anything here, or?
I think Eric has nailed it, and I guess I think people should always ask questions, exactly like Warren has just asked, and it's, where are you buying your products from? Are they being shipped? Are you buying from a gas station that's produced its gas, it's refined its gas here locally, or somewhere else and had to ship it? And I think pipelines, my knowledge, and Eric can correct me, if we're going to ship our products around, we want to choose the method that's the lowest emissions. And pipelines, they are not politically always accepted, but they are, my understanding, the lowest emissions for doing this activity.
Compared to training, using trains to get them around, and also pipelines filled with refined products like gasoline or diesel are inherently a lot more risky than one filled with crude or synthetic crude.
All right. Warren, thank you so much. If you have any questions, this is your last chance to ask our guests questions around the oil and gas sector, technology being used to reduce emissions. Give us a call, 1-800-716-2221. We got an email, Margot and Eric, I would like to share with you, and then I kind of have a follow-up questions on this as well. So Ross in Saskatchewan writes, your guest said oil companies' contributions to remediation fund mostly covers cleanup of abandoned wells. According to Parliamentary Budget Office, the environment liability, taxpayers on the hook, will be $1 billion by 2025. The report is written in 2022, and in the last 5 years, the federal government has spent millions funding cleanup of abandoned wells. Eric, I don't know if you want to say something to Ross' email.
I think Margot might be the better one to answer this exactly. I know the technical details, but yes, that is some interesting numbers.
Yeah, and I think it's really good sleuthing. Great work, Ross. I actually, too, when preparing for this show, I was looking at stuff about the number of abandoned wells and the leakage of methane and the leakage of gases, CO2, from those wells. And so that reporting, right, isn't linked to this reduction. So this is good news, the reduction, but it's not great because there's still so much leakage, and that aerial accounting of what the leakage and what the emissions are, I think, is so important. And the sad thing is it usually takes a few years to catch up to these announcements that are coming from the industry and the government.
What John was referring to is the Orphan Well Fund, and through that mechanism in Saskatchewan, and I think Alberta has a similar thing, you have to post if you're going to license an oil well in the province, you have to post a bond and a certain amount of money in order to clean up that well. And if you clean it up, you receive that bond back. If you do not, that bond is what's used to clean up, is the funds that's used to clean it up. Unfortunately, that fund did not come into effect until after 2005 or so, and the oil industry has been going strong in Western Canada since the 1950s. So as you can imagine, there are a lot of legacy wells there to clean up first that did not have that bond. But hopefully going forward, we'll see that liability decrease.
I'm curious, talking about the taxpayers and who's paying for this. Do we know how much it costs taxpayers to run the carbon capture operations?
The cost to run, I'm uncertain of. It was at the time it was built in 2009. I think it cost on the order of $700 million in addition to a new coal unit there. So the total cost of the new coal and the capture on it was about $1.4 billion. As it stands now, it takes about 20% of that power now to heat the amine, or the solution that it uses to clean the CO2 out of the ground. I'm not sure what the levelized cost of electricity is on that, but it's obviously more expensive than just burning coal without it or burning natural gas. But to achieve a 90% emissions-free product is probably worth it at this point.
I want to take a bit of a step outside and look at Saskatchewan in the Canadian context. Margot, how would you say our province is doing? We talked about some of those initiatives, but looking at all of Canada, when we're looking at meeting national targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, how are we doing in Saskatchewan at this point?
Yeah, I keep saying good, not great, because any news like this is good, like reductions of emissions is good. Partly, though, it's due, what I read is from a reduction in the oil and gas that's produced, right? So our emissions would go up if we're actually going to produce more oil and gas. So we need to look at overall efficiency, and these figures that we're talking about today are total. They're not actually telling us that we've done a lot better in efficiency and reductions through those types of measures. So I think there's just so much more that we could do, and I'm concerned with not losing our focus on carbon pricing, which has driven this incredible 71% reduction we're talking about, and we're not going to have that anymore. And that is what's driving a lot of the reduction in emissions in industry. So the cessation of the output-based performance standards I'm concerned we're not going to see this continued reduction into the future.
Okay, so what do you want to see happen now then?
We're going to have to bring back our environmental regulations. And I know we're also focusing on tariffs and international and our Mexican-American trade, but we can't lose our focus on the environment. With all of the fires and the drought that we're experiencing, which is costing a fair amount to the government of Saskatchewan and to the taxpayers of Saskatchewan, I think we need to come back and revisit our costs of reducing emissions.
Given all that, Eric, pulling out a little closer here, would you say Canada is pulling its weight on the world stage?
I think we're definitely trying. In response to what Margot just said, we are maybe not funding research the way we could in order to develop the solutions. We are working very hard at the PTRC to figure out ways to reduce that environmental footprint, not only of oil production, but of energy production in general. So we've moved ourselves from oil and gas production, the people who are experts in oil and gas and know how fluids move through the subsurface, also become experts in geothermal energy and how to move that water through the ground. The new swimming pool in Regina is an example of basically an emissions-free heating source that we will have for that pool instead of natural gas. And the drive to make that upfront investment in a geothermal system instead of just another natural gas boiler was driven by the federal government's not just the carbon pricing, but specific targeted initiatives to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in this way. So, are we doing all we can? No, I think there's more we can do, and a lot of it is. I don't speak to the political aspects, but there are technical challenges that we are overcoming every day and that we are working on at places like the PTRC and equivalent organizations throughout Canada.
I could talk with you so much longer. There's still a lot of questions and a lot of interesting stories to talk about, but I'd like to thank you both so much for joining us today. Eric, thank you very much.
Thank you, Teresa.
And Margot, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Eric Nickel is Chief Operating Officer with the Petroleum Technology Research Center, or PTRC. Margot Hurlbert is a professor in the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Regina, and she's Canada Researcher for Climate Change, Energy, and Sustainability. Thank you so much to the team behind Blue Sky for putting together the show today and this week. Nicole Huck, Sam McCack, Tori Gillis, and of course, we want to thank you for listening today